We have all seen them in old photographs. Vast white palaces, glass domes, and colossal statues rising above the crowds at the world's fairs. The official version tells us they were temporary plaster stages, built in a rush for a single summer and then demolished without regret. But what if that story isn't harmless nostalgia? What if these fairs were the last public appearance of entire cities that did not belong to our world at all? This question is the starting point of our investigation. At first glance, the story of the world's fairs sounds simple and even inspiring. We are told they were grand festivals of progress, where nations gathered to display their latest machines, art, and ideas. Cities dressed up for a season, the lights were turned on, the crowds arrived, and for a few brief months the future seemed to materialize in stone, glass, and steel. Then, just as quickly, the stages were dismantled and life returned to normal, or so the official version goes. According to that version, everything about these fairs was temporary. The palaces, colonnades, and domes were, we are told, little more than hollow shells made of plaster and cheap materials, thrown together for spectacle and never meant to last. Their purpose was practical: to impress visitors, boost trade, and showcase industry in an age obsessed with invention. Once the fair closed, there was no reason to keep them. They were too costly to maintain, too fragile to survive the weather, and too specific for everyday use. We can trace this narrative through several famous examples. In London, the Great Exhibition of 1851 gathered under the glittering roof of the Crystal Palace, a structure celebrated as a marvel of iron and glass. In Chicago in 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition rose from the shore of Lake Michigan, a white city of vast neoclassical palaces glowing under electric light. A few years later, Paris hosted its own spectacular displays, crowned by massive exhibition halls and monumental gateways. In each case, we are assured these were stage sets, not cities. Guidebooks, postcards, and official reports all reinforce the same idea. They speak of exhibition grounds and temporary pavilions, constructed on land that would soon be cleared for railways, parks, or residential districts. They emphasize ingenuity: prefabricated parts, standardized columns, lightweight cladding. The message is consistent. Human genius, aided by modern industry, could conjure entire dreamscapes out of nothing, and then sweep them away without a trace. It is an elegant story. It fits the spirit of the era: confidence, speed, faith in technology. But there is one detail this story never quite explains. If these were only temporary showpieces, thrown up for a single season, why do they so often look and feel like complete cities? Why are the layouts so coherent, the sightlines so carefully planned, the plazas and avenues so perfectly proportioned, as if designed for a way of life rather than a 3-month spectacle? Consider the scale. Some World Fair complexes covered hundreds of hectares, with boulevards, canals, bridges, and entire districts of monumental architecture. The official timelines tell us these ensembles were designed, approved, financed, and built in just a few short years, often on land that, until recently, was swampland, railroad yards, or empty fields. We are asked to believe that an era still transitioning from horse-drawn carts to motor vehicles could, on command, manufacture an entire miniature civilization and then calmly demolish it. We are also told that the materials were cheap, that many facades were simply plaster over brick or wood. Yet the photographs show something else: intricate sculpture, towering colonnades, domes with finely detailed ribs and coffers, statues placed with mathematical symmetry. Temporary theater sets rarely demand such obsessive harmony of style and proportion. They do not usually require the careful alignment of axes, fountains, vistas, and ceremonial squares that we see repeated from fair to fair, continent to continent. If all of this was truly built from scratch for a brief performance, why do the plans and maps of these grounds so closely resemble real urban plans? Why do we find thorough grids of streets, service roads, even hints of underground corridors and utility lines beneath what is described as a disposable stage? To understand what might be hiding behind the official narrative, we have to look closer at these drawings, at the construction schedules, and at the invisible infrastructure that supported these so-called temporary cities. Now let us walk through these so-called temporary cities as if we were in a museum. The photographs are our glass cases. Inside them, the first thing that catches the eye is the palaces. Long facades lined with columns, crowned with pediments and statues. We are told these were hollow shells of plaster on flimsy frames, decorative skins meant to impress from a distance. Yet the deep shadows along the colonnades and the sharp edges of the cornices suggest something else. It looks like weight. In Chicago's White City, every avenue seems to end in a monumental building. A dome here, a triumphal arch there, a hall with a forest of pillars in between. The official explanation is simple. The organizers wanted unity of style, so they imposed a classical costume on every pavilion. But look at the repetition of proportions, the rhythm of windows and pilasters, the way one building locks into the next as if they belong to a single blueprint. Who spends this much effort aligning facades that are meant to vanish after a single season? Now move closer to the details. The columns are fluted, with capitals that echo carved stone. Friezes run along the roofs, filled with figures and wreaths. We are told it is all plaster and cheap ornament, but anyone who has watched plaster crumble under rain and frost feels an unease. Would you risk miles of facade to such fragile skin, in climates where winters bite and storms roll in? The same pattern appears in Paris, St. Louis, and other fairs across the world. Different continents, different organizers, different architects, and yet the same vocabulary. Domes, colonnades, symmetrical courts, reflected in still pools. It is as if a single invisible hand pressed copy and paste across the map. The official story tells us these were original creations, custom designed for each exposition. Our eyes tell us we are looking at variations of one and the same city. Now pay attention to the glass. Many of these fairs included glazed roofs and conservatories spanning spaces that even today demand careful engineering. We are assured that these too were temporary, thrown up quickly and torn down without regret. But large glass surfaces are not forgiving. They require precise support, frames anchored in foundations that will not shift with the first crowd or the first storm. Is it really believable that such systems were improvised for a season, only to be smashed and carted away? Fountains rise in the plazas, sending water into the air. Statues cluster around their basins on steps and terraces. This is presented as theatrical decoration, a way to delight visitors. Yet the way the water is distributed, the number of jets, the balance between pools and channels, suggests a hydraulic system buried out of sight. Temporary stages rarely sit on top of networks of pipes and pumps that no one will ever see. All of these elements, the domes, the colonnades, the glass halls, the fountains, share one uncomfortable trait. They do not behave like props. They behave like architecture. The more we follow the lines of these buildings, the less they resemble hastily assembled scenery, and the more they resemble a coherent urban fabric, already mature when the fairs arrived. This is not the language of a carnival. It is the language of a capital. If this was merely decoration, why does every photograph give us the feeling of walking through a real city rather than a fairground? Why do the buildings carry themselves with the calm of things that expect to outlive us? To understand what the world fairs really were, we must now look beneath their surfaces, at the plans, the construction records, and the hints of infrastructure hidden below their shining streets. To understand what these fairs really were, we have to step away from the facades and look at something far less romantic: the numbers. Not the postcards, not the slogans about progress, but the raw logistics of building what the photographs show us in the time the official story allows. Take construction time. Again and again, we are told that entire exhibition grounds were designed, approved, and built in 1, 2, sometimes 3 years at most. In that window, organizers supposedly transformed swamps, fields, or rail yards into fully functioning temporary cities, complete with palaces, avenues, canals, and electric lighting. On paper, it sounds like a triumph of planning. But imagine coordinating tens of thousands of workers without modern computers, without cranes as we know them, without global supply chains humming in the background. Does this timetable still look realistic? Now consider the floor area. Some fairs covered hundreds of thousands, even millions of square meters under roof. That means foundations, walls, staircases, galleries, roofs, miles of corridors. The official version insists that most of this was lightweight, easy to assemble, and easy to remove. Yet even a lightweight structure of that size devours material and labor. Timber must be cut, transported, and prepared. Bricks and metal parts must be cast, shaped, and delivered on time. How many factories, how many trains, how many ships would have to work in perfect harmony to build a city-sized theater set, only to see it destroyed months later? Then we have the number of individual buildings. Fairs did not consist of one grand hall and a few tents. They were swarms of pavilions, national exhibits, industrial halls, art galleries, administrative offices, restaurants, hotels. Each required separate design, approval, and construction. The narrative tells us that nations competed to outdo each other, that every facade was designed from scratch. But when we look at the plans, we see something else. Blocks of architecture slotted together like pieces of an existing grid. Is this really the chaos of improvisation? Or the careful occupation of a layout that was already there? We rarely hear about what lay beneath: water, sewage, gas, electricity, tram lines. Sometimes even rail spurs and tunnels served these temporary grounds. Visitors needed toilets, lighting, drinking water, drainage. Food had to arrive, and waste had to leave. The official accounts mention this only in passing, as if such systems appear and disappear as easily as painted canvases. In reality, subterranean infrastructure is the most stubborn, costly, and permanent part of any city. Who installs all of that under a stage that will be torn down after a single performance? Supporters of the conventional story will say that human ambition can achieve miracles, that the industrial age was capable of wonders we underestimate. And they are right. Our species can do much when it is motivated. But motivation has limits. No sane builder pours colossal resources, time and effort into constructing an entire functioning city, complete with buried networks and massive halls, only to erase it almost instantly. At least, not if that city truly began as an empty field. When we add up the timelines, the surface area, the building counts, and the hidden infrastructure, the equation stops balancing. The fairs look less like construction projects starting from zero, and more like renovations, facelifts, rebrandings of a fabric that was already present. It is as if, for a brief moment, the doors of an older city were opened to the public under the harmless label of exposition, and then closed forever. As if we were allowed one last warehouse sale of a capital that had already been sentenced to erasure. This was not a fair. This was a farewell. Everything we have seen so far, the impossible architecture, the cramped construction timelines, the buried infrastructure, starts to look different if we allow one forbidden thought. What if the world fairs were not the birth of new cities, but the last public appearance of old ones? Not the triumphant opening of the modern age, but the carefully staged funeral of a previous world. Look at the pattern that repeats across continents. Again and again we see almost empty cities suddenly come to life. Districts that, according to official history, barely existed a few years earlier, suddenly host oceans of people walking through finished streets and fully formed palaces. Then, as soon as the exposition ends, fire, accidents, planned demolitions sweep through these same areas with uncanny speed. Whole ensembles vanish. Photographs remain. The official version calls this urban development. Old neighborhoods were cleared, we are told, to make way for something more practical. Temporary buildings were dismantled to free the land for rail lines, museums, parks, and government offices. But what if the direction of time is reversed? What if the new civic buildings are just fragments, leftovers patched into the skeleton of a mega-capital that had already stood there long before? We see streets that are too wide for horse traffic, plazas sized for crowds far larger than the populations recorded in censuses of the time. We see facades whose style seems older and more refined than the tenements and warehouses built around them later. We see photographs of brand new, fair structures already bearing traces of wear, as if they had not been built yesterday, but merely uncovered and cleaned. Under this lens, the fairs begin to resemble something else: a controlled opening of a sealed city. A brief invitation to walk through its avenues, catalog its treasures, decide what will be kept and what will be erased. A kind of inventory and liquidation of the material culture of a civilization that no longer officially exists. After the crowds leave, the verdict is carried out. Some buildings are absorbed into the new world, the rest are quietly condemned. Seen this way, the world fairs may have been rituals of transfer. The moment when the keys to these mega capitals passed from one kind of humanity to another, smaller one. A last summer in which the old world was dressed in lights and music before being broken down into bricks, blueprints, and legends. If that is even partly true, one question becomes unavoidable. If these were farewell ceremonies for a civilization before ours, who organized them? And on whose behalf was the curtain finally brought down? Now, with everything we have seen, let us look at those summer cities once more. In the grainy black and white photographs, they seem harmless. Lanterns, fountains, domes, lit up for a season of wonder. The official version tells us they appeared for a few months, entertained the world, and then politely stepped aside for real cities to grow. But history is not written by buildings. It is written by the winners who decide what to call them. They chose words like exposition, temporary pavilion, fairground. They filed away whole districts under labels that make them sound light, playful, disposable. A world-scale urban operation is reduced to a party that ended on schedule. The name becomes the curtain. Yet pieces of those summers are still here. An arch in the middle of a traffic circle, a lonely column in a park, a train station whose facade looks far older than the platforms behind it. We pass them every day, just as we pass the buried floors of old buildings, and we are told they are simply inspired by the architecture of the fairs. If even part of our hypothesis is true, then the phrase temporary exhibition may be one of the most effective memory wipes of the 19th and 20th centuries. On paper, these cities existed for one season. In stone and metal, they may have been the last visible fragments of a world we were never meant to inherit. We are living on top of those erased summers. Our streets cut through their foundations. Our maps sit over their maps. So next time you see a photograph of a World's Fair, what will you recognize in it? A harmless festival of progress, or the ruins of a civilization we are not allowed to remember? What do you think?